Hello, everyone. Good evening. And wherever you are connecting from different parts of the world, good afternoon or good night to you all. You are welcome to another session by our project, LiTE Academy, an Erasmus Plus Teacher Academy project supported by the European Commission. We are here in the 5th edition of our webinar series, which is the last one before the final edition, which will take place in about 2 weeks. But before moving forward, I would like to give brief information about our project as the coordinator. Serap Hocam, if you could move on to the next slide. So what we are trying to do in Erasmus Plus Teacher Academy project is that we are trying to help our foreign language teachers develop their capacities of multilingual, digital, and inclusive practices in their classrooms in an increasingly complex European settings. And we are hoping that we will be helping them develop themselves professionally through practices which feature integration of digital tools, inclusive practices, and multilingual pedagogies, which we are calling as DIMS. And we are 8 partner institutions from 5 different countries, including Turkey, the coordinator country, Germany, Norway, Spain, and Portugal. We have 11 institutions. 8 of them are universities across Europe, and this project has kicked off approximately more than a year ago. And we are hoping to complete the project by 2028. And in Turkey, we have Dicle University, Boğaziçi University, and İstanbul Universitesi-Cerrahpaşa representing the consortium. From Spain, we have Önen from Madrid and Universidad de Córdoba from Spain. And we have University of Hamburg representing Germany, Universidad de Aveiro representing Portugal, and Inland University of Norway representing Norway. So before we proceed, I would like to introduce our speakers for today. They will be talking about rethinking language assessment in digital, inclusive, and multilingual environments. We have 3 cohorts representing 3 institutions from our consortium. Serap Önen from İstanbul Universiteti-Cerrahpaşa, Serhat Başar from Dicle University, and Sílvia Melo-Pfeifer from University of Hamburg, all doctors from our institutions. And I would like to give the word to our team now, and I hope that you have a fruitful session today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Throughout the LiTE Academy project, we have explored how language education is evolving in response to, answering the realities of digital transformation, increasing diversity and multilingual realities. Therefore, today we will bring these 3 perspectives together through the lens of assessment. But first, we need to ask why we need to rethink language assessment today. There are 4 key reasons for that. First of all, our learners are increasingly digital learners today. They communicate, collaborate, and learn through digital technologies. And assessment practices need to reflect these changing learning environments. Second, our classrooms are becoming more diverse today. Learners bring different experiences, abilities, backgrounds, and needs into our educational settings. Third, multilingualism has become a reality across Europe and beyond. In many contexts, linguistic diversity is no longer the exception, but it is the norm. At the same time, our understanding of assessment is also changing. Assessment is no longer viewed as simply a way of measuring learning at the end of instruction, but it is today seen as a tool that actively supports learning through feedback, reflection, and learner engagement. So taken together, all of these developments encourage us to rethink language assessment today. But first, we need to ask a simple question. Why does assessment matter? First of all, assessment is often defined as gathering evidence, especially in order to make judgments about learning, performance, or achievement. Yes, assessment begins with gathering evidence. However, its influence extends far beyond simply measuring learning. It influences what teachers value, what learners prioritize, and what educational systems value. And in fact, UNESCO and UNICEF reminds us that there is a tendency to treasure what is measured. In other words, what we choose to assess often becomes what we value in education. And this raises another important question. If we treasure what we measure, how much learning remains unmeasured or devalued? This means that what we do not assess may be overlooked, although it is important for learning. For example, creativity, collaboration, learner autonomy, and multilingual competence, they are not always visible in traditional assessment practices. So this question has become increasingly important because classrooms across Europe are changing rapidly. Digital tools and AI are transforming language learning faster than many teacher education programs can keep up with. On the other hand, migration and mobility have made multilingualism a reality in almost every classroom. And yes, there are significant progress, but despite significant progress in inclusion, there are still many learners, especially those with disabilities, refugees, and minority language speakers that still face barriers to full participation and success. So the challenge is that teachers often receive training in one of these aspects, but rarely in all three. This is the gap that LiTE Academy aims to address, and addressing this challenge actually requires us to rethink language assessment today, especially through digital, inclusive, and multilingual perspectives. So when we look at digital module, within the digital module, Unit 4 focuses on assessment and examines how digital technologies can support more inclusive, multilingual, and learning-oriented assessment practices. This unit is organized around three key areas. First, participants explore the foundations of formative, summative, and learning-oriented approach. But at the same time, we analyze why digital assessment is much more than simply moving traditional tests on a screen. And second, the unit focuses on, considers how assessment can be more multilingual and inclusive. Participants are encouraged to reflect critically about validity, accessibility, and fairness, and at the same time, the ways assessment can better reflect the diversity of today's classrooms. Finally, the unit explores how digital assessment tools can be effectively used in practice, including e-portfolios, peer assessment, AI-assisted assessment, adaptive assessment practices approach. But overall, the goal is to help teachers design assessment practices that not only measures learning, but also actively support it. And participants are encouraged to reflect critically on their own assessment practices. And they are encouraged to question common assumptions about digital assessment, AI-assisted evaluation, and consider how assessment can become more inclusive, multilingual, and learning-oriented, especially in their own teaching context. So we said that digital assessment is much more than moving traditional tests on a screen. Yes, because when schools first adopt digital assessment, they tend to use the same questions, same time limits, and same assessment logic, while simply changing the format. However, digital environments allow us to rethink assessment more fundamentally. First of all, they change the temporal dimension. Learners can demonstrate understanding or collect evidence not only through, not only at the end of the unit, and teachers can gather information at the same time continuously throughout a course. The second change is model dimension. Learners can reflect their understanding not only through their written responses, but also through spoken and visual and multilingual formats. Third, they change the data dimension. This is also very important because digital tools provide richer information about learner progress, especially information about their participation, revision processes, and response patterns. But of course, it is very important to remember that digital tools do not automatically create better assessment. What matters most is how teachers design and use these opportunities to support learning. So these new possibilities become particularly visible when we look at formative and summative assessment. Let's look at traditionally, as you know, assessment has been divided into two broad categories, formative and summative assessment. Summative assessment, or the assessment of learning, focuses on evaluating achievement at the end of learning period. Examples include final exams, project presentations, certification tasks, and end of course performance assessments. Formative assessment, on the other hand, is the assessment for learning, and this is embedded within the learning process and mainly focuses on feedback, revision, and learner progress. As you see in this diagram, it illustrates digital technologies, how digital technologies have expanded the possibilities for both approaches. On the left side, we can see digital formative assessment, including end of term online examinations, for example. On the left side, we can see digital formative assessment. Teachers can use tools such as real-time class polls, gamified quizzes, digital peer review activities, and interactive rubrics and feedback forms to gather evidence of learning continuously and provide timely support. On the right side, however, we can see digital summative assessment, including end-of-term online exams, digital student portfolios, and simulation-based capstones, video presentations, and final reports. Here, what is particularly interesting is that digital environments are increasingly blurring the distinction between formative and summative assessment. For example, learners might post a draft on Padlet, receive feedback from their peers and teachers, and then revise their work. In this case, assessment becomes part of learning process rather than simply a way of assigning a grade. And at the same time, the final version of the same piece of writing later on can be submitted as part of digital portfolio and evaluated at the end of the course, making it this time part of the summative assessment process. So as a result, assessment, as you can see, is no longer something that happens only at the end of the course, at the end of the learning. It becomes a continuous process that supports learning while also documenting achievement. So this blurring of boundaries between formative and summative assessment brings us to learning-oriented assessment. Learning-oriented assessment integrates formative assessment and summative assessment together within a single framework. Rather than treating them as separate purposes, it seeks to connect them in ways that actively support learning. So the central idea is simple. All assessment, whatever its immediate purpose, should contribute to learning. This approach is built around three key principles. First, as you see, assessment tasks should be authentic and reflect meaningful real-world activities. And second, feedback should be central to assessment process and provide learners with opportunities to improve. And third, learners should be active participants through self-assessment, peer feedback, and reflection on their own progress. So digital environments are particularly very suitable for learning-oriented assessment because digital environments make it easier to collect continuous evidence of learning, provide adaptive feedback, and especially track revisions, revision histories, and organize evidence through learning management systems. So assessment is no longer treated as a separate activity that interrupts learning. Instead, it becomes part of how learning happens. But it is also important to mention or to remember that digital assessment is not a solution in itself. Yes, technology can expand possibilities, but it cannot replace sound assessment design. There are also important challenges we need to consider. For example, one concern is data privacy. Assessment results are high stakes data. And teachers need to consider how to collect their learners' information, how to store them, and how to use them. Another concern is about algorithmic bias. Automated scoring systems may reflect the linguistic and cultural biases present in the data which they were trained. So this becomes particularly important when the assessment results carry institutional consequences. Another concern is digital divide. These are related to access to devices, internet connectivity, digital literacy, may influence the performance, although they are not related to thing we are, with the learning being assessed. So for this reason, questions of validity, reliability, and fairness remain central to the assessment in especially digital environments. So good assessment is not about using the newest technology, but about ensuring that we are measuring what we actually intend to measure. The purpose of recognizing these limitations is, of course, not to discourage digital assessment, but to use it critically and thoughtfully, responsibly. When we look at digital assessment tools, we will see that different assessment purposes require the use of different tools, different kinds of tools. And here, this infographic summarizes several categories of digital assessment tools, each designed to support different assessment goals. E-portfolios using platforms such as Mahara, Google Sites, Book Creator, Seesaw allow learners to collect evidence of learning over time through writing samples, audio recordings, videos, and reflections. Collaborative and peer assessment tools such as Padlet, Jamboard, and shared documents support feedback, revision, and learner interaction throughout the assessment process. When we look at mobile and rapid feedback tools, including Socrative, Google Forms, and quizzes, enable quick formative checks and provide immediate information about learners' understanding. We also see the growing role of automated writing evaluation and speech tools, which make use of natural language processing and speech recognition technologies, which are used to evaluate writing and speaking performance, and they provide automated feedback. And finally, computer-based testing platforms such as Moodle and Canvas, they support more formal assessment through features such as automated scoring, adaptive difficulty, and randomized items. But most of these technologies can support dynamic and adaptive assessment. Okay, so for example, dynamic assessment focuses on what learners can do with help, with support, while adaptive assessment adjusts task difficulty in real time according to learner performance. And together, these approaches allow assessment to become more responsive to individual learner needs. So the key question is not which tool is the best, but which tool best supports the learning goals and the construct we want to assess. Oh, sorry. Finally, I want to highlight a few key messages from this section. Purpose should come before technology, and also assessment should support learning, not simply measure it. We should look beyond final scores and consider the learning process. And we need to use digital tools more critically and thoughtfully. And perhaps most importantly, validity remains central. We need to ensure that we are measuring what we really intend to measure. And effective assessment is not only about technology, it is also about ensuring that assessment is fair, accessible, and responsive to the diverse needs of learners. Now, dear participants, I want you to reflect on this question. You can write your answer in the chat box. The question is, when you use digital tools in assessment, what do they help you to see that paper-based assessment might miss? And what aspects of learning might they overlook or oversimplify? You can reflect on it, and at the very end of this session, we will be discussing your answers. Now I will hand over to my colleague Serhat, who will focus on inclusive approach to assessment. Serhat, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Serap Hocam, thank you so much for this great and informative start.
Thank you.
Yes, I think you can all hear me. Yeah, I think we can start. We have just seen how digital tools are reshaping the way we assess language, and I would like to build on that discussion by turning the focus to inclusive dimension of assessment. And so, for this reason, today my focus will be on the relationship between inclusion and assessment. We know that in many respects, assessment is the moment at which a commitment to inclusive education is most visible. A classroom may be welcoming in its everyday interaction, but through the way it evaluates learning, it may reproduce the barriers that inclusive teaching aims to remove. For this reason, in the next few slides, I will try to consider how language assessment can be reconsidered as an inclusive practice and how teachers can approach this in a more systematic and constructive way. In the next slide, yes, why inclusive assessment? We can see that the rationale behind inclusive pedagogy and inclusive assessment. Recent studies encourage us to understand the diversity not as a feature of certain classrooms, but mostly as a relational and ever-present condition of all of them. And this shapes how we think about assessment because it exposes an assumption that usually goes unnoticed, like assessment is neutral. Actually, it's not the case because, in fact, assessment is a social practice. It's shaped by relations of power, power distance, cultural norms, and by the assumptions about what counts as legitimate knowledge. And when we rely on a single standardized format, that format tends to reward the learners whose cultural and linguistic background already matches the institution. And in this case, inclusion is then reproduced under the appearance of so-called objectivity and merit. And for this reason, and following Torrance and Sadler, we would like to suggest that equity in assessment does not lie in applying identical procedures to everyone. It lies in creating the conditions that allow every single learner to demonstrate what they have learned in a valid way. And moving on to the next slide, it brings us to a question that connects to the points my colleague Serap raised about digital tools. The question is whether our assessment actually measures what we intend to measure or not. We are interested in with what's known as construct irrelevant variance. So there is a kind of relationship between them, but these factors have very little to do with the learning itself. And three of them are very important and they're very relevant in our settings. For example, the first one is digital skill. When a digital platform is unfamiliar or typing is required, we are partly measuring the technological fluency rather than the language. So here what we intend to measure can be different. And secondly, the linguistic complexity. In this case, let's say there is a reasoning task, which is framed in heavy academic wording. And we are partly measuring reading comprehension in this case. And again, what we intend to measure is different from what we are actually evaluating. And finally, the final example is about access. If there is an unstable connection, a shared device with other learners or siblings, or difficult circumstances before a scheduled test, it can pose some challenges. For this reason, when we recognize this, the notion of an absolute weak learner becomes vague and it's difficult to sustain. So for this reason, what we observe is never a fixed rate, and it is just a kind of situated performance. And this situated performance is shaped by many factors like the test design, the context, and the support that's available to the learner. And in the following slide, we can see what inclusive assessment looks like. And here, what does inclusive assessment actually look like in practice? We are going to discuss that. And in light of this issue, several principles emerge consistently from the literature. The first one is about the assessment, the role of the assessment, whether it should be continuous or formative. And it means offering feedback as students learn during their learning process is significant. It is not the final judgment, it is process oriented. And studies by Haiti and Timperley show that it is most beneficial, especially for vulnerable learners. The second principle is that the process matters as well as the product. So how a learner reached an outcome becomes the evidence itself. because here the outcome is not that important. The process that learners go through becomes the evidence. And the third one is the use of diverse formats. For example, project, performance, group, and portfolio assessment, in addition to or instead of conventional single formats assessment. And the fourth one, as you can see, is transparency. It means objectives and criteria are made explicit, and it is helpful for, especially for neurodivergent and neurodivergent learners and learners coming from different educational or cultural backgrounds. And finally, inclusive assessment makes room for self and peer assessment as well. And also it provides the opportunity to revise the content in a secure environment. Overall, in light of these findings, we can say that these principles broaden our access without lowering academic standards. We can make our assessment practices more inclusive, but it can also, it doesn't mean that it will lower academic performance or the standards in the class. And in the following slide, you can see one example, which is about universal design for learning. And it is a productive way of putting all these principles into practice. Because according to universal design of learning, which is applied in assessment, specifically in assessment, this framework poses a single clarifying question, and it also has a reflective function. How can learners demonstrate the same competence through different means? For example, let's say there is a shared goal to demonstrate understanding of a narrative. It is a task. And in this case, one learner come up with a recorded spoken summary of the plot and the main ideas. And the second learner built a graphic organizer. And the third one produced an annotated collection of the key scenes. All these products are quite different from each other, but the teacher assesses the same constructs. What are they? The narrative technique, the clarity, and the coherence. So as you can see, the essential point is that we build access into the assessment from the very beginning, rather than adding it as a lateral accommodation or repair. And especially when we realize that the learners are having difficulties, that would be too late. In this sense, inclusion becomes a matter of design, and it starts at the very beginning of the evaluation assessment design. So it's not just a repair. And in the next slide, yes, I can say that it is like the heart of this discussion, because here we would like to turn the focus towards us as teachers. And we know that existing studies, especially recent studies, offer an important finding. It's that teachers tend to hold positive beliefs about inclusion in principle. I mean, their belief system, their beliefs and perceptions are aligned with the main principles of inclusive pedagogy, but these beliefs are not actually reflected in everyday practice all the time. So we can say that there is a considerable gap between their belief system and practice. And what can help us to close this gap is structured and evidence-based reflection, which is also which has an inquiry stance. And this framework, which includes two complementary movements, can help us to achieve that. So on this infographic, I will try to explain it. First of all, on the first part, on the left part, you can see there is a part for reflection. Generally, it is more about teacher beliefs, and it helps us to examine four areas. In the first one, at the first level, we examine our beliefs, and we shift our attention from the deficit of individual learners towards the mismatches between learner and their environment, because we accept that a failure or a problem may not only stem from the learners themselves. So it may stem from the mismatch, the convergence between the environment and the learner. For this reason, at the level of design, we also ask whether our assessment offers more than one valid pathway to success or not. And at the level of interaction, the third level, we consider whether our criteria are actually transparent to every single learner or not. And finally, at the level of evaluation, we ask whether we can separate what a learner knows from how they are required to express it. So the first framework can help us to assess and reflect on our existing beliefs and practices about assessment. And generally, we can say that it's more at the cognitive level, But the second one, the one on the right, provides a more practice-oriented perspective, and it's also more evidence-based. Why? Because we aim to improve our practice here through inquiry, through evidence-based learning in the classroom. Drawing on the action research tradition, we propose a kind of cyclical form here. And here we have 4 different stages, but it doesn't mean that it is just confined to one circle or one cycle, because it's a repetitive form and it has a continuous dimension. First, we plan. How do we plan? By choosing one feasible and significant issue. And for teachers, for us, it might be hard to find an issue to investigate. It's not a big deal because we can collect data. I mean, our students can help us to identify, to locate the problem. We can collect data through interviews. I mean, we can interview our students, individual interviews, group interviews, or we can distribute some anonymous feedback forms, questionnaires, open or close-ended. And by gathering data, we can identify a problem, and based on that problem, we can, in light of inclusive assessment. Secondly, it is the time to act. We act. How? By introducing a single deliberate change, transformation in our practice. And later, after we implement it, we observe by gathering evidence directly from our students. How can we gather evidence to show or to understand whether our revised practice is effective or not? We can take a look at their insights. I mean, we can analyze their answers to anonymous feedback questions, close or open-ended questionnaire items, interviews, or just by observing their participation patterns, the frequency of the participation, willingness to participate, their samples of work or tasks, their handouts, and also you can just focus on their achievement in the class, I mean their active participation. And later, we reflect on the end product. But it doesn't mean that it's the final end product because, as I said, it's a repetitive cycle. By interpreting that evidence together with colleagues, that's important because it can also have a collaborative dimension before we re-enter the cycle. And in this way, we can perceive inclusive assessment as a sustained and collaborative form of professional inquiry, rather than a fixed conviction or one-shot practice in the class. By doing so, we can have a more sustainable and continuous perspective to transform our classrooms. And when it comes to the takeaways for teachers in light of these frameworks and inclusive assessment, to bring all these ideas together, we would like to offer a few principles. And in total, we have 5 key principles here. The first one is to be able to diagnose the mismatches rather than the deficits, because we said that it doesn't stem from the learner. It may stem from the mismatch between the learner and the learning environment. So it's important to read a learner's difficulty as a gap between the learner and the surrounded environment before assuming that it stems from the learner. That would be a great first step to inclusive assessment. Secondly, to design access from the very beginning by providing more than one valid way to demonstrate learning rather than adding a lateral accommodation like a repair when learners have difficulties. And the third takeaway is to make the criteria as transparent as possible, because clarity is a condition of fairness and not an optional extra. It should be given at the very beginning. And the fourth is to gather and act on student evidence, as I highlighted in the action research part, in order to strengthen fairness in the class. And how can we collect evidence? As I mentioned in the previous slide, we can collect samples of their work, anonymous feedback, or by just focusing on their participation, we can do that. By doing so, we can have the chance to retrospectively reflect on our previous beliefs about assessment and inclusive pedagogy. But it's not just about our former beliefs, because we can also introspectively reflect on our current practices in the classroom. And also, we can have a future dimension. We can prospectively envision future classroom practices regarding inclusive assessment. And the last takeaway, it is also important for us is to reflect collaboratively, if possible, with your colleagues, with other teachers, and conduct action research collaboratively with your colleagues. This is very critical to expand the impact, the transformation. Rethinking inclusive assessment through this sustainable perspective and collaborating with your colleagues, with your students, either to develop action research plan or disseminate your findings, I mean your findings about your action research, could be the most productive and effective way to promote pedagogically inclusive assessment practices. In this sense, inclusive assessment may mean more than a lateral accommodation added for the benefit for just a limited number of students. By doing so, you can expand the scope of the change. And it may become a structural and ethical orientation that can strengthen the learning for all our students, all our classrooms. It can also empower teachers, and eventually it can transform the institutional culture of learning. And yeah, finally, we have the reflection part. I would like to close this part by reflecting on your practices. So in this question, we try to offer a constructive starting point for your in-class practices. So we want you to kindly consider where inclusion is already present in your assessment and where there is room to improve that. So I want you to think about this question, and later after the final presentation, we are going to have more time, and we will try to remind you this question again, and later you can reflect on your answers and about your suggestions. And I think I'm ready to hand over to my colleague, Sílvia, and Sílvia will take these concerns further by examining how we can assess multilingual students fairly and more meaningfully. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here with us. And if you are still not convinced that assessment matters, just stay with me for this third part of this talk on how assessment matters and in matters of linguistic, social, cognitive justice. So I think if you were attending the talks until now, you will see that assessment and probably also mismatch are the keywords of this presentation, because we have been talking about mismatches between how we assess and how the students really practice nowadays and use digital media. We have been talking about mismatches sometimes between formative and summative assessment, or in what we want to assess and what we really assess by the end if we do not adopt more inclusive practices. And in this part of the talk, I will be talking about another mismatch. The mismatch that some students find during the evaluation process, let it be diagnostic, summative, formative, when they still cannot express them in the target language, in the language of the assessment, usually the language of schooling. And let me start with this sentence from a wonderful PhD thesis that I've just read from Canada. And it's very emotional, from a teacher that says, I was an English second language student too, and I could answer the questions in an assessment if I only understood what the question means. Because when there is this mismatch between the linguistic plurilingual repertoire of the students and the language of school, you see these three cases happening. The learners do not understand the context, or they don't understand the context, the content, but not the question, or they understand the content and the question, but cannot express themselves and give the answer. So these are very common issues for students being assessed in a language that they do not speak yet or write completely. And this is if you were learning a foreign language, or if you have to be displaced to another country as an adult, you can see this mismatch and the gap between what you already know and what you can say about what you know. So this is the kind of gap and mismatch that we are talking in this third part of the talk. And in the next slide, I think you will understand this even more accurately, because I brought a provocative sentence: multilingual lives matters, because when you talk about assessing multilingual kids through monolingual lenses, you are not contributing to social justice, and you are perpetuating institutional discrimination based on monolingual formats of evaluation. And by doing this, monolingual assessment, just plays this role in institutional discrimination, because test takers have different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, and they might not even be familiarized with the test culture or the test language. So assessment might, even if we don't want, assessment may contribute to maintain the status quo, reproduce inequalities, and reinforce inequalities. So it might be leaving everything just as it is, and we know that that would mean not giving a voice to all the students. And it would mean nowadays also that you even reproduce this distance between kids and the schools, families and the schools. So multilingual life matters because all multilingual kids matter, and their families matter, and the founts of knowledge from each family, disregard of the backgrounds they are coming from, linguistically or culturally, they matter for integration. They matter for achieving brighter futures. So multilingual tests and multilingual formats are important to avoid language rights violations, and this is a principle by Alana Shawami. And the next slide, and going on again with the idea of mismatches, even if the literature already says that, okay, there are some formats that you can use to design, implement, interpret results from evaluation with multilingual learners, the truth is that it is still very difficult to adopt these formats, either because we don't consider them in the legislation, in the programs, in the materials available, or also because even when we are keen to use multilingual teaching practices, we do not transfer it to assessment practices. And in the very beginning, we saw this slogan that we just value what we access. So if you don't access multilingualism, and if you don't integrate multilingualism in the assessment, so there might be this mismatch between what you teach, how you teach, and how you evaluate. Let me give you two examples. In the third bullet point, you see the reference for Cota Velasquez et al. 2024, and these are the results of a huge study in the scope of the Promoting Plurilingual Education project, an Erasmus Plus project in Europe, and 800 teachers answered a questionnaire, an online questionnaire about how keen they are to adopt multilingual teaching and assessment practices. And guess what? They are already implementing plurilingual, multilingual pedagogies in the classroom. In the previous series, we talked about translanguaging. Well, guess what? Teachers in Europe are already implementing translanguaging to teach. But in the same teachers, when asked about how they evaluate after using these multilingual pedagogies, they tend not to introduce multilingualism in assessment. And for various reasons, let me just say, if multilingualism is integrated in oral instruction, like in the questions, giving synonyms, explaining the question in other languages, they might think of, okay, fair enough, I'm helping to understand the question, but that was not the case for written assessment, for example. And in these cases, they will stay pretty much entrenched in monolingual ideologies in written evaluation. And in the second example, let me give you the example of the federal state I live in Germany, Hamburg. And in Hamburg, you see a very interesting case of figure, because the program, the curriculum already says that teachers should use the linguistic repertoires of the students, that students should be able to connect knowledges, the knowledge that they developed across their lifetime in different languages. So teachers should capitalize cognitively these resources that the students already developed. But in the other way, when we go to the same documents, the same federal documents, and we read the section on assessment, assessment is still pretty much a monolingual practice. So nothing is said about how to include plurilingualism, multilingualism in assessment. So you see here this mismatch between innovative plurilingual practices being like predicated into the curriculum, but the other way around, assessment remains monolingual. So you see this divide, if you want, between instructions for teaching and instructions for assessment, and assessment remains usually monolingual. So no way of including linguistic comparisons, cross-linguistic transference in these tests. What does it mean? It might mean that we see if the student doesn't understand the questions, if they cannot express themselves, that can lead to frustration and barrier in the time of giving the test. And of course, they will need more time to structure what they want to answer, meaning that answer a test in a multilingual context with our multilingual repertoires might be more time-consuming than a student that already understands the question, just to give you an example. So this might lead to a sense of alienation, a sense of disconnection, further demotivating the student. And if we adopt, in the other way around, multilingual assessment, we are giving the student the feeling that you are tailored to experience success. Your motivation matters. What you know matters. What your family knows matters. What you learned previously is important. You matter, because all our students matter. So I think this is a clear message from adopting multilingual assessment in education. And just to give you a brief definition, because I've been talking here about assessment and multilingual assessment, but not giving you a definition. So let's start with this definition, pretty general, from Vogt and Antja, from a book, Open Access, by Peter Lang, that define multilingual assessment as any form of assessment, formative, summative, or diagnostic, which incorporates multilingual elements, whether related to language or content. So, just to be clear, you can use multilingual assessment in content subjects and in what we call language subjects. So these are the two possibilities. And you can use multilingualism either in designing the questions or letting the students use the full linguistic and semiotic repertoire to answer the questions. And you could say they are basic principles, but these are principles of fairness, cognitive fairness first, but also affective fairness. So the idea that everybody can have success in evaluation. Also validity, because if students cannot answer, it doesn't mean that they do not know the content. is probably just because they cannot express themselves. So as the colleagues before me already said, this brings enormous issues of validity. Are we really evaluating what the students already know, of course? And in the next slide, I will bring some of the strategies that we can use in our daily practice to include multilingualism in assessment and also to introduce some elements that can provide more fairness when assessing multilingual students. So, and let me say that we have here two main strategies, and one is really making assessment multilingual, including diverse languages, and the other one is more about providing, let's call it, compensations for students with a multilingual background and that are probably still learning the language of the school. So let's look at the 4 strategies under multilingual approaches to content assessment. And here it's clear to see that you open up formats for answer that are not just based on the knowledge of the language of schooling. So you can assess the students in their L1, and you might ask yourself, I can see your faces, but I don't know the L1s of all my students. You don't know, but you can use digital tools. So let's back to the first part of this talk. Use digital tools to provide formats of assessment that include the L1s of your students. And you can also use mixed formats. This is the bullet point number 2. You can combine forms of assessment in which the students can use both the language, even the languages of school, and their L1, sometimes even 2 L1s. You can also propose assessments in multiple languages. If the student, the learner just arrived and you have to do, for example, a diagnostic assessment of what the student, the learner already knows from their previous lives before arriving to a new country, you can just assess what he knows in different subjects using his own language. And then another one, it might seem very provocative, but it works. And you might allow translanguaging when the students are answering a question, like using different languages or even concepts in the languages that they used before or was using in the previous schools in the learning path. They can use semiotic repertoires, draw, make arrows, make schemes, like interpreting some sort of the content that they are asked to show. And the second column, as you see, is about accessibility through resources during the test administration, what I called previously compensatory strategies. So you can allow your student extra time to support reading and writing, because as I said before, if you are reading a text in a different language and you have to produce a comment on this text, first you have to understand the text, so it's more time consuming, and then you need more time to structure your own answer, so this is also time consuming. So time, even if it's not a multilingual resource, you can also, of course, give them more time to organize their thoughts, to understand the texts. Another possibility is just to reduce the number of questions, because they might lead to overload, so many things to do at the same time. The others are already writing, I'm still interpreting the text, so you can just reduce the number of questions. You can allow the use of external devices and resources, like translation tools, dictionaries, glossaries. You can also orient the test in sort that students do not need to write that much, but they will prove comprehension and knowledge through selecting visual images, manipulating images, charts, etc. So tests that are not that language-based. And you can also develop dynamic assessment formats like portfolios, or produce a learning product during the school year. So it makes the learning process not just be a final task, something that they are evaluated for in a certain moment of time, but a task that proves development over time. And the last point is close to the third one, in allowing the use of technology and digital tools, because the aim is not to evaluate how they use these tools, but then how they can use the tools for answer correctly and show what they already know in specific school subjects. And I'm almost done with my part. So takeaways for teacher. If you want to integrate digital tools, bring together multilingual teaching and multilingual assessment for more social justice, cognitive justice in teacher education, in the teaching. First, just think that when you are assessing a multilingual students, and if you want to assess some competence, you are not just assessing those competences, you are probably also thinking of monolingual, multilingual skills. So think of the validity of the tests that you construct. And then the criteria, again, I think this is a transversal criteria that we had also in the previous presentations, is transparency. Make criteria explicit and be clear about how you are going to value and cherish the multilingual resources that your students, that your learners bring to the classroom. And then, because the process is just as important as the product, even more important perhaps, think of including reflective components on language choice and strategies, because this is important. It's not just about the final grade, it's about the way, it's about how you got there, and how you can improve yourself. So reflexivity is important to value the process of learning and not just the final product and the final outcome. And finally, think that you have to frame the use of artificial intelligence and translation tools, and that they have to be seen as mediation supports and not shortcuts for the answer. So this is the ethical, aspect of including artificial intelligence and some digital tools. Students have to know that they are using them as scaffolding for the answer, as mediation, and not as a shortcut in which they will just provide an answer and never think about this anymore. And finally, coming to the conclusion of this three-parted presentation, if we bring all together, we see that beyond our concern, digitality, equity, multilingualism, we see that traditional assessment practices reveal intersectional inequalities in education. It can be linguistic inequalities, it can be cognitive inequalities, it can be neurodivergence, it can be a lot of things. And they sort of converge in the assessment process. If you use digital tools for assessment, well, they can support design of valid and inclusive multilingual assessment, because it's not just about languages. You can have multimodality using the translanguaging for assessment, using graphs, images, signs. So much goes behind languages and one language only. They can allow multilingual language use, flexible language use. They can provide you interactive feedback in multiple languages. So you can ask, for example, artificial intelligence to give you a feedback on your, let's say, text production in the language that you know better. So this is also evaluation, giving feedback using digital tools. You can also have cross-linguistic documentation of what you did over time. So seeing how your use of your multilingual repertoires developed over time during for learning purposes. So think about this. Inclusive assessment is also multilingual assessment. And if you want to use multilingual assessment, inclusive assessment, think that you have to evaluate learners regardless of physical, psychological, social, linguistic, cultural differences. And this requires separating the conceptual understanding from linguistic accuracy, because sometimes students know the content, but they don't know how to express it into monolingual native speakerist norms. So that there might be a gap. So mind the gap when assessing your students. And bringing all the three reflexive questions all together. If you want to go through the references, be my guest, there are some there. But as I was saying, if we want to reflect and have some time for discussion, we bring all the three questions again. Perhaps you missed some of them or one of them. So let me go through the three again. When use digital tools in assessment, what do they help you to see that paper-based assessment might miss? And what aspects of learning might they overlook or oversimplify? So remember, not just chances and opportunities. Sometimes they came up with new challenges. And then question number 2, what works well in your when you assess, and what could be more inclusive, and what is one change you could make? And third question, think about your classes tomorrow, if you are teaching tomorrow, and how could you start implementing multilingualism in assessment in your own context right away? What opportunities and challenges might you encounter? Your peer teachers, the students themselves, school as a structure? Just think about this, and let's open the floor for the discussion. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the multimodal assessment of our talk. We are happy to see all the hearts and hands. And if you are shy, you can answer, but you can also, of course, interact with us around the three questions. Serap, perhaps you can go back to the questions.
Yes, sure. I will. First of all, the first question. For a long time, there is not a question, but I think there is a reflection here. One of the participants says that for a long time, all language instruction was required to be taught in French at many schools here in France. The metacognitive knowledge was privileged over the fluidity or expression. The idea was that it would become a conduit for expression. However, multilingual approach to these is basically giving the students ownership and choice over their learning, isn't it? Would you say that allowing learners to have choice is one of the major tenets of inclusive learning and assessment? Yeah, asks a question.
I don't know. I'm probably just answer very spontaneously. For me, it would be important to give students a choice because they will feel more valued. This is also a principle for a very important principle of differentiation, pedagogical differentiation in education. So yes, I would say that it's important that students also have a say on how they would prefer to be evaluated, formats, languages. it will probably depend on the school culture and how you also teach your students, because if you never use multilingualism in teaching and then you include it in assessment, it's also mismatching. So mind the gaps and try to close these gaps. So it would be my very spontaneous answer to you, Brendan.
So please feel free to reflect. There are no any other questions. Well, I think one of the participants asks, how can we be objective by observing the students? I mean, in terms of assessment, they ask, how can we be objective by observing the students? I mean, in terms of assessment.
Is this a question in the chat? Because one student or attendee, Brendan, says that he would like to see the questions again.
Questions. Okay.
Yeah, the 3 questions.
Here are the questions
the proposed,
again.
But these are just, you don't need to stuck to those questions. If you have other questions, Brendan, just let us know.
Thanks for sharing so many interesting ideas, say.
It was a pleasure.
My question is in the Q&A part.
Oh, so let's see.
Sorry. How can... here. Okay, so for example, one of the participants says that, thank you for this fruitful session. At first, I have 2 questions. In recent years, the Turkish Ministry of National Education has introduced centrally prepared examinations for some grade levels and subjects in secondary education. The reform aims to increase standardization, fairness, and comparability across schools. However, it has also caused discussions about teacher autonomy, assessment diversity, and inclusion, and the alignment between innovative classroom practices and standardized testing. At the same time, language educators are increasingly encouraged to integrate digital technologies, AI tools, multilingual perspectives, inclusive pedagogies into their teaching. How much assessment autonomy should teachers have in a system where some examinations are designed by Ministry of National Education? And yes, to what extent do centrally prepared exams encourage teachers to teach to the test rather than focus on communicative competence and meaningful learning? Such a long question. Yeah. Good question, actually.
Yeah, I thought you might know more about the context of Turkey. I would just like to say that already in the formulation, and this is so typical for policy, there's standardization disguised as fairness, as providing all the students with the same assessment formats would be fair. You cannot not ask the same questions to students who have different abilities or disabilities. So I think that what would be fair would be not to give standardized tests to all the students. But this is just my interpretation of the first part of the question and the formulation that sometimes fairness is equated to standardization. And this is unfair for most of the students who have different learning attitudes, abilities, resources, skills, and it's really just pretending that pretending that fairness comes
Definitely.
through standardization. But let me hear you about you and the Turkish context.
Well, actually, I want to move to another question. How should language teachers effectively manage the workload of tracking and documenting these continuous formative learning processes, especially for multilingual learners, in particular when institutional mandates heavily favor standardized summative products in the curriculum? My professors are more knowledgeable, but I believe that in Turkish background there is a gap while assessing multilingual learners. Yes, I definitely agree. The case in Turkey, there is such a gap.
Yeah. Sorry if I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but it speaks to my heart, this question also of workload. We know that teachers are really busy. So we say, yeah, you have to evaluate also the multilingual kids with their resources. You use the technology. You have to have instructional principles for design. So everything the three of us just talked about today, right? So how is a single teacher going to manage all this with limited time and limited resources? And I really don't have the final answer. Please don't get me wrong, but I think the teacher doesn't need to do everything alone. So if you
Yes.
want to teach your student, your learner for autonomy means being able to follow, to design the learn path. And if we consider including digital tools, if we consider including multilingualism, informative assessment, of course, the student can be the own master of evaluating how is going, how is progressing and developing through the use of these resources. So teach your students to be autonomous and to use this tracking and documentation for his own learning design, meaning that you probably cannot assess everything, but you are giving your pupils, your learners, your students tools for becoming autonomous learners, and that also means being able to evaluate their own development over time.
Thank you for your answer, and I agree with you. And in many contexts, unfortunately, macro level policies or constraints may hinder teachers. But it is also very important for the teachers to highlight or to pay more attention to their agency. I mean, as you mentioned, collaboration can make an impact, can make a change in this case, because we expect teachers to be change makers in their environments, in their classrooms. So collaboration with other teachers, with students, you can have students voice their minds. You can collaborate with your colleagues, and it will help you to have more learning spaces within your environment. So even though there are too many challenges within your environment, there is also one way to diminish these challenges and make your learning environment more transformative and progressive. For this reason, it's really important to make use of digital affordances and teacher collaboration and democratic classroom environment by developing the relationships and rapport with the students. By doing so, at least you can minimize the challenges in your classrooms, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Okay. There is another question, actually. Can we prepare a checklist to measure the validity of digital assessment tool for teachers? Well, actually, yes, we can design a checklist for that. Checklist of construct validity, checklist of content validity, and also checklist for reliability and consistency. This is possible for digital assessment tools as well. Is there any questions I miss here in the Q&A part and also in the chat box?
Oh, we have a very nice comment from Sarah. Sarah, thank you so much for the kind words. I think this is really just starting to challenge intersectional inequalities in education. And if we want to do this assessment as a big role in this main aim. Thank you for your kind words.
There is a comment from Brandon. Honestly, I'm not really in the environment where evaluation is the most important. I teach languages to trauma patients. But I would imagine that open-ended paper-based evaluations are like whiteboard, kind of what Serap Hoca and Serhat Hoca discussed with technical tools that allow learners to express themselves within the time limits. But digital tools can enable them to go further, even getting into data-driven learning. We just have to be careful, like what Professor Sílvia and AI is framed as a mediation support, not shortcuts. It says. Thank you for your comments. And yeah,
Serap,
that's all, I guess.
We have a very nice comment also from Sílvia about how you can use digital tools. I don't know, he was interacting with the person that said that they had a Chinese student who could not understand Portuguese nor English in the classroom. So what could teachers do in the case? And then I connect with the comment from Sílvia and said, yeah, you can use digital tools, let them use automatic translators, language recognition, so that he can understand the questions, know the main subjects, translate it into Chinese, and then understand at least the content that is being transmitted or taught by the teacher, so that at least cognitively the student might connect the content to what he already knows and develop further, even if it's first in the L1, in order to better then be able to transfer and learn the content in the L2. Let me just add, it's not a publicitary moment, but there is a very nice platform called Binogi, and you might be interested in see how it works, because it presents content in different languages with subtitles, without subtitles. You can turn on the sound, you can turn on the captures, and you always have the school subject provided in different languages, the language of the schooling, and you can also have two languages while listening, and with a lot of languages included for transmitting curricular knowledge in different languages. So you might want to look and see if this could be something not just for the Chinese student in Portugal, but perhaps also for the Portuguese student I'm still have in Germany. So nice videos.
Okay. Thank you very much for your contributions, for your questions and reflections. I think we are about to conclude, if there is no other further questions.
I think you still have to announce the next webinar setup.
Yeah, but I think we have another
We
question.
want to have you back next week.
Yeah, we have another
Alright.
question, a final question about inclusive assessment, because yeah, there's a very good question about the concerns of the parents. Diana Torres mentioned that. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, it might be very hard. I mean, considering the standardization of assessment and macro level policies mandating more standardized tests, it might be hard to convince parents or students to have some more formative ideas. But at least in the class, we can make use of these innovative ideas by creating groups, by collaborating with other teachers, and by creating more innovative practices. Without grading learners, we can start to assess them more inclusively. And later, I think teachers, by conducting action research, they can maximize the impact, the pedagogical impact in their classroom. Because I have seen many examples that, especially in South American countries, conducting action research can lead to a societal change. I mean, teachers get together, they conduct action research, critically or individually, collaboratively, and it may lead to a change in the society, and it can even encourage some policymakers to take further action. So it is very important to disseminate your findings and make your outcomes, data more visible. Now, I am sure that eventually it may lead to a better impact on our inclusive practice in the class.
So the next webinars, let's say next slide, please. And Serap is coming to announce the next webinars.
Yes, the next webinar, the sixth webinar, I guess, designing language learning tasks for digital, inclusive, and multilingual classrooms will be held on 29th of June. We would like you to participate in this webinar as well. Okay, thank you very much. And see you in the next webinar, sorry.
Thank you for staying all the time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Serap, for doing this incredible moderation of everything. It was lovely.
Thank you, Sílvia, for your
Serhat, I
presentations
don't want
and
to
Serhat.
discriminate against another gender.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye. See you.
Bye. See you next time.